Hello and welcome. You're watching the Daily Report. It's Tuesday, October 12th here in Korea, and I'm Min Sun-hee. We begin now with a check on the pandemic situation as we return from a long weekend here in this part of the world. I have Kwon Suh standing by with details on that. Suh, welcome back.
Good to see you, Sunny.
Right, now Korea is starting the work week with its daily tally on the 1,300 level, Suh.
Right, Sunny, we are. And although it is a plunge from the figure we talked about the last time before we went into the holidays, it is, however, an increase from Monday's figure. 1,347 cases were tallied as of 12 a.m. this Tuesday. And that includes 1,334 domestic transmissions with 13 cases from abroad. Now, we are seeing some positive developments in the past week, a decline here since the end of last week. And also, although we are seeing a slight rise here from Monday to Tuesday compared to last Tuesday, it's also an on-week drop. And with that, the average number of daily domestic infections in the past week stands at a little over 1,800. So let's take a closer look by region. The capital Seoul and Gyeonggi-do province reported 482 and 411 cases respectively, followed by 81 in Incheon. And it is good to see that a few spots here in the nation are seeing single-digit figures of daily infections. With that, Korea has accumulated 334,163 cases, with a death toll at 2,594, with 11 additional fatalities reported in the span of 24 hours. And now let's move over to our vaccination updates. Korea has recently hit a milestone of 40 million people that have received at least one dose of COVID-19 vaccine. That's almost 78%, and also more than 30.6 million people have gotten their second shot or are fully vaccinated. And also, as part of the fourth quarter inoculation plan here in Korea, the country has become one of the latest countries that has started its booster shot program. We will have more details on that in our later segment. But first, let's take a look at the world updates. So we've got 239 million accumulated infections, with a rise of almost 380,000 new cases in the span of 24 hours. If we go over to the 20 countries with the highest number of cases, the U.S. here with 45.3 million is still seeing around 100,000 cases a day. The UK and Turkey also saw over 30,000 cases in the past day. Let's also take a closer look at some Asian countries here. Thailand and Japan are seeing a similar number of infections as well as total fatalities. Thailand has recently surpassed Japan with resurgences in infections. And then we've got Singapore here, the country with the 104th highest number of cases around the world. But Singapore is now also seeing resurgences lately, and Sunny will connect to Singapore in a bit. And those are the general updates I have for now, but I'll see you back again. Sunny?
All right, so thank you for now. Right, U.S. pharmaceutical firm Merck is seeking emergency use authorization from relevant authorities for its antiviral COVID-19 pill. Now, for more on this latest development on the pandemic front, I have Yeun here in the studio with me. Yeun, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Right, Yeun, let's start with this oral drug to treat COVID-19 now.
Right, so drug makers around the world have been racing to develop COVID-19 pills and as a complement to vaccinations, as the world looks for a way to coexist with the coronavirus. Leading the pack is an antiviral pill by U.S. drug maker Merck, marketed under the name Molnupiravir. On Monday, Merck asked U.S. drug regulators to authorize its pill for treating patients with mild to moderate COVID-19 infections.
Right, now, Yeun, I hear the cost of this new oral medication is fueling much debate.
Right, as with any drug, this drug does have a share of its own advantages and disadvantages. And the biggest edge is that you can now treat COVID-19 much more conveniently at home. All you need to do is take the pill, and interim analysis has shown that the pill lowers the rate of hospitalizations and deaths by 50%. This means no more expensive visits to the hospital just because you have the early symptoms of COVID-19. And it's also been proven to be effective against the highly contagious Delta variant. But we also do have to think about the drawbacks. Those include the cost, which is around $700 per person for the full treatment, although according to an insider at Merck, the final price could still change. Also, you have to take 4 capsules twice a day over the course of 5 days. So over the course of the treatment, you'd be taking a total of 40 pills. Also, health experts say that while it could be a game changer, it's not a complete substitute for COVID-19 vaccines. Take a listen to what a health expert from Texas had to say on Merck's latest treatment.
And so there's a lot of attractive features about it, just like there is for Tamiflu for influenza, which is another way to think about this. It does reduce the severity of illness, but doesn't prevent it entirely. And whether or not you wind up taking this medicine for whatever reason, you should still get vaccinated, because that's the best way to prevent you from getting sick.
And not to mention, Merck has just applied for emergency use authorization in the United States. They pledged to produce enough pills for 10 million patients by the end of this year, of which 1.7 million people's worth would first be distributed in the United States. The Korean government had previously said it's holding discussions with Merck for a purchase deal, but no firm agreement has been signed up as of yet.
I see. And staying on the local front here, Korea's booster shot campaign, as our colleague Suh mentioned earlier, has kicked off on this Tuesday. Do tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. So medical workers will be the first in line to get their third booster doses today. And that's some 45,000 frontline medical staff who've been assigned to the care of COVID-19 patients. Most of them received their second dose of the Pfizer vaccine back in March or April. So their booster shots will be a Pfizer jab, which they can get at the medical center they work in. Next up will be seniors aged 75 or older, and those who work at nursing homes are also eligible. And this aligns with the WHO's recent recommendation that people with weak or compromised immune systems should be given a booster shot.
All right, Yeon, thank you for now, but do stay with us for the extended talk with Suh. Right, now for more on how authorities here are responding to the recent decline in daily infections, I have Suh back at the desk. Suh?
Hi again.
Right, so what are authorities saying?
Well, Sunny, despite an increase in movement after a number of holidays, tallies are actually going down, and that's not only due to fewer testings, because a weekly assessment is showing us a clear decline in cases. So here's more.
The average number of daily domestic cases stood at 1,961 during the period between Sunday, October 3rd and Saturday, October 9th. That's a 21.2% decline from the week before, and we are seeing a downward trend in both the capital region and areas elsewhere nationwide. The reproduction rate of the virus in the past week stands at 0.89, falling below 1 after rising 4 straight weeks.
A number below 1 means that one COVID-19 patient would transmit the virus to fewer than one person on average. The number of people in critical or severe conditions stood at 361, according to PAC, with 56 people having lost their lives in the past week, meaning a drop from the previous week. What officials say is notable is that the decline in these figures appear to be the result of rising vaccination rates, as movement in the country has actually been going up lately, and previously an increase in movement usually translated to a further spread of the virus, no matter how well social distancing measures were followed.
Right, now this rise in movement, so that you just mentioned, was something that Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyun touched upon on this Tuesday morning.
Right, Sunny, it was the second time this month that Koreans have been enjoying a 3-day extended weekend or holiday, with the government having expressed concerns of a further spread this fall season. Prime Minister Kim, in fact, said the latest 3-day holiday was even worse when it comes to traveling.
Over the long weekend, we saw more vehicles on the expressways on a daily average compared to the Chuseok holidays and the National Foundation Day weekend. I'm sure you've also heard about the large crowds of people who travel to places like Mount Seorak and Jeju Island during that time. If you have traveled over the weekend, I ask you to get tested before returning to your daily routines. The temporary testing centers that have been set up at highway rest stops and bus terminals will remain open for the time being.
And with that, the Prime Minister also called on related ministries and officials to make thorough inspections at frequently visited tourism spots, and also called on continuous cooperation from the nation's people on the vaccination front, and also to make sure to get their second dose. In fact, he believes that this Tuesday we are expected to reach the 60% goal of people who have been receiving their second shot already. And then he mentioned ultimately that will lead to a phased return to our daily lives, or the so-called living with the COVID-19 strategy.
Right, and staying with that, a special committee, I understand, has been launched to pave the path to a phased return to normality. Yeon, what more can you tell us about this?
Right, so Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyum actually said a special committee will be set up on Wednesday, and that will supervise adjustments needed to coexist with COVID-19. And the Prime Minister will be the chair, leading a group of cabinet-level officials. They include the Minister of Health and Welfare and the Minister of Economy and Finance, among others. And experts from the private sector will also be part of the committee to find ways of gradually easing our current COVID-19 restrictions. The committee will hold its first meeting early morning tomorrow, where its members will discuss a broad range of agendas, including people's livelihoods, education, public safety, and prevention measures.
And I understand the committee is going to include those in the private sector as well.
Yes.
Right. And so, are there any updates on when exactly can we start this phased return to a new normal?
Well, authorities are still speaking about that early November goal, but we are seeing this recent decline in infections. So Prime Minister Kim Boo-kyum at that earlier meeting has actually expressed hopes that we could even have that phased return at an earlier date. So maybe even late October. He didn't really mention late October, but did say it could become a faster process if we have these fatality rates and also the number of critically ill patients at a manageable level. But what we also have to remember is that the current social distancing measures will come to an end at the end of this week. So next week we will have to have new levels of social distancing measures. So maybe that will not be the regular extension that we have been seeing in the latest weeks, but maybe an adjustment is expected, and that new social distancing scheme may be the beginning of that eventual return to our daily lives.
I see. Well, we'll hope so. We'll keep our fingers crossed for that. So as always, thank you very much for your coverage. And Yeon, thank you for being with us today. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has called for the strengthening of his regime's military capabilities to counter what he insists are, quote, hostile forces against Pyongyang, but clarified that this call is not aimed at Seoul nor Washington. Kim Da-mi reports.
The North's leader Kim Jong-un has criticized the U.S., saying that there are no grounds to believe Washington is not hostile toward Pyongyang. According to the North state media on Tuesday, Kim made the statement Monday in a speech at a defense development exhibition to mark the 76th founding anniversary of the ruling Workers' Party. He went on to accuse Washington of creating tensions on the Korean peninsula and said such tensions will not be easily resolved because of the U.S. Kim also denounced Seoul for being, quote, hypocritical and having double standards for continuing to boost military capabilities. Kim Jong-un then pointed out that strengthening national defense is the regime's #1 priority. Yet, he made sure to note that such a move is not intended to target a specific country like the South or the U.S., adding that the North's main enemy is war itself. He then added that the horrific history of using armaments against the same people on the peninsula should not be repeated. Kim's speech came less than 2 weeks after the North test-fired a new anti-aircraft missile in what was its 4th missile launch in September alone. There was no military parade to mark the founding anniversary on Sunday. Instead, Kim Jong-un delivered a speech that he will work towards improving his people's living conditions, pledging to resolve issues related to food, clothing, and shelter for the next 5 years. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
And top security advisors from South Korea and the U.S. are poised to meet for talks on Tuesday local time in Washington, D.C. Topping their agenda is North Korea. Kim Yo-sun has more.
President Moon Jae-in's top security advisor Suh Hoon, who is visiting the U.S., is expected to sit down with his American counterpart to discuss North Korean issues. Speaking with journalists at Ronald Reagan Airport outside Washington, D.C., Suh Hoon, director of the National Security Office, said Monday that it is time to reassess Pyongyang's relations with Seoul and Washington and discuss related matters with the U.S. He's also expected to make his case for the signing of a declaration to end the Korean War armistice as a means to facilitate the regime's denuclearization during his meeting with Washington's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, scheduled for Tuesday local time. As President Moon has been highlighting the need for an end-of-war declaration to bring about eternal peace on the Korean peninsula, this is expected to be a crucial item on the meeting agenda. This is Suh's first solo visit to the U.S. since he attended a trilateral meeting between South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. about 6 months ago. Pundits are focusing on why Suh's Washington visit has been moved up to this week from previous reports that it would take place around November. It's now left to be seen whether Suh's visit could inject further momentum into dialogue and negotiations between the two Koreas or even between Pyongyang and Washington, especially as it follows the regime's reopening of the communications hotline with Seoul after some 2 months of suspension. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
The World Bank believes the global economy will expand 5.7% this year, but the bank's president has cautioned over widening disparities among countries. According to David Malpass, advanced economies were already seeing pre-pandemic levels of growth, but the output in developing countries remains below pre-pandemic projections. In response to this reality, the World Bank plans to raise $100 billion in donations to help countries overcome what it calls tragic reversals in development. 3 US-based economists have won the Nobel Prize in economics for their real-life experiments on the labor market. Our Kim Sang-min explains.
This year's Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to a trio who showed how natural experiments can be used to answer some of society's most pressing questions, from the minimum wage to migration. US-based economists David Codd, Joshua Angrist, and Guido Imbens shared the award. David Codd of the University of California, Berkeley, was recognized for his work, which showed how an increase in the minimum wage does not necessarily lead to fewer jobs. His work has since been used by policymakers, including in the Biden administration's push for a $15 minimum wage, though his interpretation of the results is slightly different.
I think the main thing that's really come out of that, contrary to what everyone thinks, it is not, that we should raise the minimum wage necessarily, but it's rather a focus on a different way of thinking about how wages are set.
Joshua Angrist and Guido Imbens shared the prize for their framework on the study of these kinds of real-life issues that cannot be investigated through traditional scientific methods. Combined, their pioneering work using natural experiments could make economics more applicable to people's daily lives, helping policymakers observe actual evidence of the outcomes of their policies.
In social sciences, it is not possible to have controlled experiments, but their work allows us to achieve sophisticated results similar to what we would get from lab experiments.
The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences said the 3 economists, quote, completely reshaped empirical work in the economic sciences.
Natural experiments are everywhere. So thanks to the contributions of the laureates, we researchers are today able to answer key questions for economic and social policy, and thereby the laureates' work has greatly benefited the society at large.
The award comes with a gold medal and 10 million Swedish krona, or some $1.1 million. Unlike other Nobel Prizes, the Economics Award was not established by Alfred Nobel, but was created by the Swedish Central Bank in his memory in 1968. Kim Sang-min, Arirang News.
On the local front, the central bank has decided to hold steady its benchmark interest rate at 0.75%. Our Chang Tae-yeon has more on this decision.
South Korea's central bank has frozen its key interest rate at 0.75%. The news follows a monetary policy meeting Tuesday. Uncertainties still exist in the global stock market, including fallout from issues stemming from China's debt-ridden real estate giant Evergrande. Domestically, spending is low due to the virus. The Bank of Korea raised rates by 0.25% in August to manage any risks of inflation. It has consecutively raised benchmark interest rates only once since the year 2000. That was in July and August in 2007. There's usually roughly a 3 to 12-month gap before any additional raises are made, creating a gradual hike to minimize chaos in the financial market. Experts say that there could be a rise in interest rates in November in response to rising household debt and property prices. As the U.S. Federal Open Market Committee, dubbed FOMC, is scheduled for early November, South Korea is likely to make any decision after observing changes in the market. And South Korea's next monetary policy meeting is scheduled for November 25th. Chang Tae-hyun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, Korea's exports during the first 10 days of October jumped 63.5% on year to post some $15.2 billion. The Korea Customs Service has linked the performance to strong demand for key products. Now, by sector, exports of semiconductors rose 22% on year, while steel products surged over 160%. Outbound shipments of petroleum products were up more than 200% amid surging global oil prices. The country's exports have been gaining ground for the past 11 months in a row. And staying with exports, outbound shipments of Korea's kimchi grew about 14% during the first 8 months of 2021, according to the Korea Customs Service and the local food industry on Tuesday. Kimchi exports during the January to August period stood at some $111 million. Meanwhile, imports of kimchi fell almost 10% to around $86 million, resulting in a trade surplus of $25 million. Should the trend persist, Korea may witness a trade surplus for this national side dish kimchi this year for the first time in 12 years. Authorities in Singapore say it will take at least 3 to 6 months for the country to reach a new normal. Now, this forecast follows a tightening of COVID-19 related measures there to slow community transmissions and to ease the potential burden on hospitals. For more on the situation in Singapore, I have Professor Teo Yik Ying at the National University of Singapore. Professor Yik Ying, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Very nice to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Right. Professor, let's begin with the surge in daily tallies there. Amid an ease in social restrictions back in August, I believe authorities have been recording over 3,000 new infections on a daily basis in recent days. What more can you tell us about the situation there?
So the situation in Singapore is primarily driven by the Delta variant, which we all know that it's much more highly transmissible. And because of that, and the fact that actually Singapore's restriction has been lifted to a certain degree, that people are moving about in the community, infections is happening. What is most interesting is that Singapore continues to chase down to the very last case. We perform very rigorous contact tracing, and we actually test the asymptomatic people as well. And that explains why we have about a couple of thousands of cases in a day, of which actually more than 80% to 90% of them are all asymptomatic with no symptoms.
Right, that is good to know, Professor. Now, Professor, what are your personal thoughts on the COVID-19 situation in Singapore?
It's definitely one that is looking positive. Despite the number of cases, people must be worried that, wow, Singapore experiences 2,000-3,000 cases in a day. But as I mentioned, more than 80 to 90% of the cases actually are people with no symptoms. And if we look at those with mild symptoms, the asymptomatic and the mildly symptomatic explains more than 98% of the cases. So less than 2% of the numbers that we see are actually the symptomatic cases. So by and large, we have vaccinated about 84% of the entire population in Singapore now with very effective vaccines. So things are actually looking great. And right now, we're moving towards a step of treating COVID-19 as endemic.
Right. Professor, what can you tell us about the treatment of asymptomatic patients in Singapore? Are they also required to enter a facility, or can they stay at home for treatment?
So if we have this conversation 2 weeks ago, actually the asymptomatic cases, some of them would be in facilities or even in the hospitals if they are of a particular age, like 60 years old and above. But right now, all the asymptomatic cases are allowed to recover at home. And that is a big change in the way that Singapore is treating COVID-19.
Right. And Professor, what has been the impact of having some 83% of the population there fully inoculated against the pandemic?
So I think the biggest impact is really the fact that when we see COVID-19 spreading in the community, by and large, most of the people that are infected actually didn't know that they themselves are infected. But if we didn't perform our contact tracing, many people wouldn't even know that they test positive. But the fact is that we know now that with the use of vaccines, it actually dramatically reduced COVID-19 to a condition that is very much like influenza, like the flu. We see that the death percentages is less than what we previously have without vaccination, and that it means that our death rate is about 0.1% of the people who are infected. That is exactly the death rate that we see worldwide for influenza.
Right. Professor Ye King, I understand booster shots are being offered by authorities there since this past Saturday. What are your thoughts on the need or the necessity of booster shots?
So we've seen that data from Israel that actually the protective effects from the vaccines does start to drop, especially after the 6 months mark. And so because of that, the Singapore government has decided to start off by giving people boosters, and those are people who are 60 years and above, subsequently 50 years and above, including the healthcare workers. And on Saturday, the government actually announced that they will allow the boosters to be given to people 30 years and above, provided that they took their second dose 6 months before. So I think this is going to be a necessary step because the world is going to come to terms with COVID-19 through a very careful mix of vaccination, boosters, and actually natural infections.
Right. Professor, do you believe the presence of oral pills like the one being produced by Merck, which my colleagues and I addressed earlier on the program, to treat COVID-19, of course, will mark perhaps an end to the pandemic?
Well, I think we are seeing the tail end of the pandemic in some privileged countries, the advanced economies in particular, because they are able to rely on vaccines to actually boost the immune levels of the people out of COVID-19 waves. But I think the introduction of molnupiravir is going to be a game changer in the sense that now, even if someone is infected, particularly those at the high risk stratas, people who are old, people with underlying medical conditions, they now have an effective form of treatment that significantly reduces the risk of disease and death by more than 50%.
Professor, there is talk about the need to treat COVID-19, as you mentioned, like the common flu. How do you respond to such talk?
I think if we look at what is going to be the long-term and sustainable strategy for countries against COVID-19, it will have to be treating COVID-19 as a form of endemic infection. But when we do that, the question is, are we able to make sure that the people remain protected against severe disease, against death? And I think this is really where we rely on vaccination, we rely on therapeutics like what we just talked about to help to reduce the risk of severe disease, severe symptoms. And that is the long-term game plan, because we will have to find a way to live naturally with infectious diseases, just like what we have done in the past with influenza, with measles, and with mumps.
Right. Then having said that, Professor, for countries that are exploring the option of exiting, marking exit, that is, from the pandemic, what are some of the prerequisites that are needed?
You mentioned, prerequisites in terms of?
To ensure an exit strategy from the pandemic for countries across the world.
I think definitely having the ability to distribute vaccines effectively and equitably is going to help the entire world and not just the privileged countries to exit COVID-19. But equally, I think one thing that is worth highlighting is that it's not just the vaccines, it's not just the treatment, but equally we need people to be infected naturally, but because they are protected by the vaccine from disease and death, the natural infection is going to help to boost the immune level of people such that they are able to resist COVID-19 in the long term.
I see. One final question, Professor, before you leave us. What are your thoughts on Singapore's plans to launch the vaccinated travel lanes with its counterparts from around the world?
So definitely quite pleased to hear that we have a vaccinated travel lane with South Korea. So I look forward to people moving between the two countries. But I think, again, we are starting to see the world move into a phase where vaccinated people are allowed to resume quite a bit of their lives, including overseas travel, whether it's for business or for leisure. And I do see that the vaccinated travel lane is going to expand beyond bilateral agreements to multilateral agreements. But before we reach that, we really need to arrive at a consensus around the way that we recognize vaccination, recognize the type of vaccines that is available in different countries.
All right, Professor Yik Ying, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Financial markets, including that here in Korea, have been noting fluctuations amid uncertainty over the course of COVID-19 as a growing number of countries seek an exit strategy from the pandemic. Accordingly, in today's studio session, we take a look at the persistent concerns and the potential countermeasures to address this reality. I have Professor Kim Se-won from Ewha Women's University. Good to have you with us, Professor Kim.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Mr. Daniel Yu at Yuan Securities joining the session virtually. It's a pleasure to see you again, Mr. Yu.
Pleasure to be here.
Right, Professor Kim, we'll start here. Now, the Korea Development Institute believes the local economy is facing a host of challenges to growth amid the prolonged pandemic. Do you share this outlook?
I believe so. Actually, until the end of second quarter or the end of June, Korean economy was staying on the track of over 4% economic growth. But economic uncertainty is rising quickly from August of this year. This economic uncertainty is basically generated by another round of coronavirus pandemic that weakens the recovery of domestic consumption, which covers almost 60% of domestic GDP. Also, there are quite a few global economic uncertainties, like US Fed interest rate hikes possibilities is higher, and inflation, global inflation is rising together. And there are quite a few issues on Chinese private corporations' bankruptcies. So these all adds more uncertainties to Korean economy.
Right. Meanwhile, Mr. Yu, a dark cloud has also been cast on the local stock market, where the Kospi has fallen below the 3,000 mark for the first time in some 6 months. How do you respond?
Right. If you look at the overall market, it has fallen down to below 3,000 Kospi level. We haven't seen that since the beginning of this year. Clearly, this is not based on the fundamentals, but I guess the future worries or expectations. If you look at the Korean won, it has depreciated quite significantly. And also the equity market has fallen, and at the same time you had interest rate rising, and obviously that is a triple weakness. So clearly this isn't related to the uncertainty of the global economy. We talked about the Evergrande issues of China. The professor has told us regarding that. And also there uncertainty about the inflation pressure coming from the globally because of the higher oil prices and energy prices. And on top of that, they're concerned about the further weakness of the economic growth rate because of the COVID being continued to be hindering the overall economic growth rates. And if you look at the U.S. unemployment rate shows it's falling, but at a very low pace. So all these are resulting into the uncertainty about the future market. But at least for the time being, the fundamental seems to be reasonably good, as we hear a lot of the economic numbers coming out right now is very positive numbers for Korea.
Right, including the export figures. Mr. Yu, foreign investors here unloaded some 2 trillion won worth of shares as of late last month. Now, do you expect the selling spree to continue for the time being?
Obviously, this is related to what's happened to the Korean won. And also, I guess on top of that is because what's happening to the dollar index. If you look at the dollar index, it has risen from 90 territories to now 95 plus, so has appreciated by 5% plus as an index. Now, Korean won tends to have a higher volatility than the dollar index, and it has risen by more than 10%. So right now it is hitting 1190 plus. So that's the main reason why the foreign investors are very uncomfortable, because Korea is not base currency, and when you have a trend in such that the currency weakens, then even though despite the earnings are growing and that the Kospi should be rising, but you will lose money out of the currency movement. So that's why foreign investors have been selling, but they're not necessarily keep selling. It's just that they're selling and buying and selling and basically just trading the market, just trying to understand when exactly the market to turn around. But for the time being, we don't see Korean won appreciating aggressively. It continues to be in a weakness territory, including the US dollar index continues to be in a rising trend. I think that we need to wait until what happens to the real debt ceiling issues. So far it's been delayed, but for the time being, still nevertheless it's there. So therefore, I think that the dollar index appreciating is resulting into the Korean won and foreign net sellings.
Right. And Professor Kim, what are your personal thoughts on the declining value of the Korean won, especially against the US dollar?
Well, $1 exchange rate is rising up to 1,201 per dollar, which is the highest level in a year. I think there are two major factors that raises the value of US dollars. The first is US market interest rate is rising up quickly. It has a strong power to make people to buy more dollar-based assets. For example, last year's US 10-year Treasury bonds yield was 0.5%, but it is now 1.6%. And secondly, as Mr. Liu explained, foreign investors in Korea are selling domestic stocks in a huge scale. As of October, foreign investors sold almost $2 trillion valued net sales of domestic stocks. But along with these factors, there are longer and stronger factors that appreciate Korean won, which is the surplus of trade surplus makes Korean won more stronger in the long run. So in the long run, there is a possibility that Korean won will be a little bit appreciated.
Right. And Professor Kim, I believe government bond yields, meanwhile, they are on a sharp rise. Could you tell us a bit more about this reality?
Government bond yield is a very important barometer of future status of the economy. The rising yield of government bond means that the economy is recovering in the near future, and there will be higher price level in the near future too. So there are recently two important factors that raises the bond yield, government bond yield. The first is the inflation is rising up well over 2% on year every month in Korea. And secondly, the possibility of interest hikes by Bank of Korea is higher than before. So these two factors together are raising government bond yield. And actually, the same situation is developing in the United States too. US bond yield is also increasing for the same reasons, higher inflation and US Federal Reserve's tapering possibility.
Right. Back on the local stock market, Mr. Yu, the head of the Financial Services Commission, Ko Seung-bom, believes external factors, which I believe you touched upon briefly, are to blame for the plunge in the local stock market. Could you tell us a bit more about your thoughts?
Right. I think that the external factors are definitely one of the reasons. But on top of that, I think the domestic issues are there as well. But let's start with the external factors. Clearly, there's a worry about stagflation in U.S., meaning that the growth rate is slowing down while the inflation is rising. So we saw energy prices rising rapidly. Now oil prices hitting well above $80 per barrel. And the natural gas prices, the coal prices, all are rising very rapidly. Obviously, that results into higher cost of producing goods. And if that's the case, then Korea, being highly manufacturing-based country, we will suffer the margin decline, the possibility of that. And we clearly import all the oils, obviously. So therefore, that is negative news. And so therefore, the stagflations, meaning that the inflation pressure is there while the growth factor of the global economy is slowing down. That means that maybe people are worried about the export numbers slowing down as well. On top of that, we had China suffering with this Evergrande issue. China having huge bubble in the property market. Clearly, there's uncertainty about the property market crash with the Evergrande maybe failing in the future. I don't think that will happen, but nevertheless, just to worry about that is making a negative implication for the Korean market. And as you know, the the property market seems to be hugely overpriced as well, and the government is tackling on that issue with the interest rate hike and etc. So that all resulting into the volatility in Korea. It's interlinked, but I think that the decision of raising interest rate is probably not a good thing for Korea.
Right. And Professor Kim, what do you believe is the reason for the retreating local stock market?
Well, I think the most fundamental reason for more volatility in domestic market is higher inflation driven by global economic recovery and low material price increases. And that also increased the possibility of central bank interest rate hikes. This higher inflation is also intensify central banks' interest rate hikes in both of the United States and Korea. So that gave additional volatility to the market. And as Mr. Yu explained, Chinese corporations' bankruptcy possibilities as another volatility to domestic market. The fact that Beijing is about to let these companies to bankrupt is adding more volatility to Hong Kong market and Shanghai market, and that is partially related to domestic markets volatility.
Right, because it's like a domino effect then.
Right.
Mr. Yu, the US Congress recently agreed to a temporary lifting of the country's debt ceiling to avert a national default. Now, having said that, how does this agreement look to affect perhaps the local stock market activity?
Well, if you look at the debt ceiling issue, this is a very political issue. There's continuation of discussion between the Republican and Democrats. And if you look at how they passed the temporarily increase of the debt ceiling till the December, the 50 senators of Democrats agreed and the Republican 48 disagreed. So there's clearly the discussions happening. But I think that the not raising the debt ceiling is a very, very negative news, and it might be detrimental, as what Ellen said, as well as Powell is talking about. We need to have the debt ceiling rising because if you look at the U.S. debt as a percentage of GDP, it is relatively low compared to any other developed countries, including Europe and Japan. So even compared with China, the U.S. is high, but nevertheless, if you look at the local government debt of China, it's not that much different. So all being said, we need that debt ceiling to be raised. If once that debt ceiling is raised, then we think that the appreciation of dollar index is not going to happen that aggressively, or rather, it will probably depreciate further, which means that will provide liquidity to the emerging market and other economies in the world, and relieving pressure of the overall financial market. So I think that this issue is a quite important issue, and we need to see that happening in a right way and needs to be solved, not just temporarily, but probably for the next several years. If that happens, then we think that the currency movement and all things will be settling down.
Right, and staying in the U.S., Professor Kim, do you see the recent disappointing U.S. jobs report as affecting the Federal Reserve's plans for tapering that you mentioned earlier?
As the inflation pressure is getting stronger in the United States, it is highly expected that U.S. Fed will begin its tapering sometime in November. But the fact is, to maintain U.S. economic growth over 7% on an annual basis, U.S. economy should be adding at least 700,000 new jobs every month. But in the last 2 months, the job report was really disappointing. For example, in August, U.S. economy added only less than 400,000 jobs, which was very disappointing. And another disappointing point was September's job report reveals that U.S. economy only added less than 200,000 jobs. So Given that very weaker labor market situation, it is pretty sure that U.S. Fed will reconsider the timing of tapering very soon.
Right. And Professor Kim, how do you respond to concerns of global stagflation amid disruptions in supply chains worldwide?
Global economy is not fully recovered from last year's economic crisis. And we know that inflation goes on everywhere, including United States and Korea. So by definition, we can say that we are under very loose situation of stagflation, the sum of high inflation and depression. But we have to know that the international trade is very strong, and there, as Mr. Liu pointed out, the major companies' performance is very strong. So I believe that the possibility of stagflation is weak against the media's expectation. So I think that as vaccination is more controlled over a pandemic, so economic recovery will be continued, and the possibility of stagflation will be lower than before.
Right. And Mr. Yu, staying with the rampant disruption of supply chains, do tell us a bit about the businesses that you believe will be hard hit by the disruption of supply chains.
Well, I guess if you look at the overall uncertainty about the implications on the third quarter earnings, a lot of people are concerned about the supply chain disruption and also labor cost increases and shortages, and the COVID-19 cost impact, and the transportation and flight cost, and then the raw material cost. So if you really think about that, basically, if you look at the industries in U.S., heavily affected are consumer goods. In terms of the Korea, that will be the same thing. If you look at any products that are imported, that would be definitely negative news. But in terms of the export goods, there have been some uncertainty because of supply chain in the auto industries and semiconductor industries, but we don't think that will be a long-lasting. So going into the next year, we will see recovery happening. But as already you know, the equity market is down because of that uncertainties. And obviously, a lot of the stocks been hammered are the ones that semiconductor industries and auto industries and a lot of the export ones.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Kim, a US-China summit is poised to take place later this year amid their standoff on the trade front and more. What are your prospects on this upcoming talk?
Well, it is said that Biden and Xi two summits meeting will be held, a virtual meeting will be held by the end of this year. But Biden administration continues to impose a 25% tariff on Chinese products, which was initially imposed by Trump administration. And I think that Washington will strongly demand that some improvements in the situation of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Xinjiang, which is considered as internal affairs to Beijing. So it looks to me that it is difficult to have something further progress on two sides summits meeting on trade war between United States and China.
Right. Mr. Yu, what are your thoughts now on the central bank's decision to hold steady its benchmark key interest rate at 0.75% that came earlier on this Tuesday?
I must say, thank God about that, meaning that raising interest rate is a very negative direction in an economy that if you look at the consumer debt as a percentage of GDP, it's well above 100%. And if you look at the US, even with the base currency, when the consumer debt has hit the 100% plus, when you raise interest rate, you go through a huge financial crisis. And clearly, if the Korea raises interest rate too fast, so-called mid to low income bracket individuals will be suffering significantly with this currently the COVID-19 impact, and their debt level is extremely high as a percentage of their assets. So all being said, I think that the raising interest rate should be very steady. It shouldn't be at a rapid pace. If that happens, then we will suffer quite significantly in terms of domestic consumption and domestic economic growth rate. Of course, Korea is highly dependent on export, and therefore we should not be just focusing on the consumer debt percentages, and we should be focusing on trying to keep the housing prices capped not resulting into a huge drop in the prices. Any rapid movement of prices and asset prices would have created a huge bubble bursting in Korea. So I don't want to see rate hike happening in any time soon or any fast pace.
Right. Professor Kim, what are your thoughts regarding the future course of the local financial market, and how should relevant authorities here seek to respond?
Well, since domestic market is pretty much shaken by foreign factors like constraint in global production chain and U.S. Fed interest rate hikes possibilities, domestic market will going through adjustment period until these factors disappears. And in that circumstances, Bank of Korea and government should be cautious on the timing of further rate increase.
Right. And Mr. Yu, I extend the same question to you. What is your forecast for the financial market here, and what is your advice to authorities?
Right. I think that in terms of any additional regulatory environment is negative. I guess tightening would be negative. We need to see what happens to U.S. A lot of people are concerned about the stagflations, and therefore I don't think the U.S. will be aggressive in terms of raising interest rate. And we should be following that trend. I think that stagflation, what it should be dwindling down as we go along to the next year. But if we move too aggressively, too quickly, then we could resulting into crisis. So I don't think that we should be doing anything aggressive. We should be just watching and see what happens to U.S. and China.
I see. All right, Mr. Yu, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts. Professor Kim here in the studio, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Right, and that brings us to the end of this edition of the Daily Report. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Do join us then, and thank you for now.